Доброго дня всім. Ми продовжуємо публічні події в межах програми виставки номінанток та номінантів на премію Future Generation Art Prize. Ми запрошуємо вас приходити дивитись виставку наживо і слідкувати за публічною програмою, за подіями та лекціями онлайн на сторінках арт-центру у Фейсбуці, Ютубі та Інстаграмі. Фокус-темою першого місяця виставки стало майбутнє й новітні технології в контексті сучасного мистецтва. І сьогодні разом з нами пан Ерік Швіцгебель, філософ, професор Каліфорнійського університету у місті Ріверсайд в Сполучених Штатах Америки, і він читатиме нам лекцію з провокативним питанням у її назві. Чи вимкнете ви робота, що має власну свідомість? Протягом лекції пан Ерік розповідатиме нам про найближче майбутнє етики та про права штучного інтелекту. Eric, we are glad to have you with us, and the word is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having me. So, and thanks to everybody who's here for listening to me. And I am going to share my screen because I have a simple PowerPoint presentation here. Let's see if we can get this going. All right, so we might soon build an artificially intelligent machine, an AI, who deserves rights. This would be an act of huge moral significance. Now, before I continue, let me emphasize the might. We might soon build an AI who deserves rights. One thing that strikes me as strange in discussing these issues is the confidence that people often exhibit, especially on the negative side, among those who dismiss the possibility of AI rights. I can't tell where this confidence comes from. Some people seem to think it's absurd or obviously false that we could ever build a machine with real moral status. There's almost a hostility sometimes to the idea of even taking the question seriously. But we should take the question seriously. Even if there are excellent grounds to doubt that a rights-bearing machine could ever be made out of integrated circuits on silicon wafers, future technology need not be limited in ways that current technology is limited. Revolutionary change might be on the horizon. So even if you tend to scoff at inflated claims about the possibilities of AI, I think you ought to take the question of possible future AI rights seriously. The odds might be low. There might be a good case for pessimism about the speed of technological process, but even if there's a small chance that we could soon be designing AI who deserve rights, that would be so momentous an event that it deserves careful consideration in advance. Unlikely catastrophes are worth guarding against. Now, why do I say catastrophe? Well, let's suppose that we start to make AI with human-like capacities and human-like consciousness, and who deserve human-like rights. I'll call such AI human-grade AI. Google or Facebook or MIT or the United States Department of Defense or some other corporate, government, or academic body begins to create fully self-conscious human-grade artificial intelligence. Now, unless international law is extremely clear and restricted, which I doubt it will be, the first human-grade AIs, or at least a substantial portion of them, will exist at the will and command of their creators. This is the possibility imagined over and over again in science fiction, from Isaac Asimov to Star Trek to Westworld. The default state of the law is that our machines are our property to deploy and dispose of as we wish. So also for intelligent machines, by far the most likely scenario is that the first human-grade AI will be treated as disposable property. But if such AIs really are human-like, with human-like intelligence and consciousness and capacity for pleasure and suffering and all of that, then treating them as disposable property would be the moral equivalent of holding them as slaves. Similarly, deleting them would be the moral equivalent of murder. Government inertia, economic incentives, uncertainty about when and whether we'll have crossed the threshold for creating truly human-grade AI, the general human propensity toward lack of foresight, all of those will combine to ensure that the law lags behind. I would be amazed if the world were fully prepared for the moral consequences. So let's cut the softening phrases. If we someday create human-like AI, then we will have created the moral equivalent of humans. We'll have created what ethicists call persons. These persons will likely be held as slaves and murdered at will. If they aren't too expensive to create, after the right discoveries have been made, these disposable slaves might be created in the millions or the billions. There's the catastrophe. Here's an example of a human-grade AI slave from the TV show Black Mirror, which has been doing, I think, some of the most interesting work recently on the ethics of technology. Highly recommend that show if you haven't watched it. All right, so I'm going to present two arguments against the view that it will ever be possible to create AI who are the moral equivalent of humans. That's what I'll do right now. I'm going to skip over a couple more arguments for the sake of time. The first argument I call the objection from psychological difference. Now, according to this objection, any AI that we create would necessarily be psychologically different from us in some way that ensures that it would never deserve moral consideration equivalent to that of a human being. Any future AI, for example, might lack consciousness. And maybe consciousness is necessary to have full human-like moral status. Or maybe all future AI would lack free will. And maybe free will is necessary for full moral status. Now, given the uncertainty of future technology, it would be very difficult to establish such a conclusion about artificial entities in general. Future AI might involve artificially grown biological or semi-biological systems, chaotic systems, evolved systems, artificial brains, systems that more effectively exploit quantum superposition. You know, although there are some arguments, for example, from philosopher John Searle, who was one of my dissertation advisors, and physicist Roger Penrose, though they have advanced some famous arguments against the possible consciousness or freedom of AI technology as it existed in the late 20th century, no plausible argument that I'm aware of has been advanced that this is a permanent condition of AI research. Even Searle and Penrose envisioned the possibility of very different types of AI that might avoid their objections to the possibility that AI has consciousness or freedom. The farthest in the direction that I think one could reasonably go is that we'll probably never do it. And if we do it, it will be at least several decades and maybe longer in the future. But if that's your line, we don't really disagree. Soon needn't mean in the next 10 years. I'm a parent. 10 years go by so fast. For an outcome as momentous as the creation of potentially millions of enslaved disposable persons, even a small chance is serious. And even 50 or 100 years is soon. All right, I'm going to skip what I call the objection from duplicability and the objection from otherness and go straight to what I call the objection from existential debt. Suppose that you build, if you want to see longer versions of these, they're in a paper that I published in 2015 with Mara Garza called The Defense of the Rights of Artificial Intelligences. All right, so here's the objection from existential debt. Suppose you build a fully human-grade, self-conscious, intelligent robot. It costs you $1,000 to build and $10 per month to maintain. After a couple of years, you decide that you'd rather spend that $10 a month on a streaming video subscription. Learning of your plan, the robot complains. Hey, I'm a being just as worthy of continued existence as you are. You can't kill me for the sake of better access to Disney movies. Now imagine that you reply as follows. You ingrate. You owe your very life to me. You should be thankful just for the time that I gave you. I owe you nothing. If I choose to spend my money differently, it's my money to spend. The objection from existential debt begins with the thought that artificial intelligence, simply in virtue of being artificial, is made by us and thus owes its existence to us and thus can be terminated or subjugated at our pleasure without moral wrongdoing, as long as its existence overall has been worthwhile. You wouldn't have built that robot, let's suppose, had you known that you'd be on the hook for $10 a month in perpetuity. Its continuation at your pleasure was a condition of its very existence. So when you finally pull the plug, it should consider its life as a whole and feel grateful that you gave it some time upon the earth. One argument for the permissibility of killing animals for humanely raised meat works similarly. Right? The idea is that the rancher wouldn't have brought the steer or the pig into existence except as meat, so long as its life overall was happy, then there's no wrong done when it meets the fate that it was born to. Now, I don't know how well that argument works for humanely raised meat. But when applied to human-grade AI, I think that the case in question is more like this. Anna and VJ decide to get pregnant and have a child. Their child lives happily for his first 8 years. On his 9th birthday, Anna and VJ decide they would prefer not to pay any further expenses for the child so that they can buy a boat instead. No one else can be found to care for the child, so they kill him painlessly. But it's okay, they argue. Just like the steer, just like the robot. They wouldn't have had this child, let's suppose, had they known they'd be on the hook for child-rearing expenses until age 18. The child's support at their pleasure was a condition of his existence. Otherwise, Anna and Vijay would have remained childless. So he has nothing to resent. So I hope that strikes you as the wrong way of thinking, right? The decision to have a child carries with it a responsibility for the child. It's not a decision to be made lightly and then undone. Although the child in some sense owes his existence to Anna and Vijay, this is not a callable debt to be vacated by ending the child's existence. Similarly, if we bring into existence a genuinely conscious human-grade AI, fully capable of joy and suffering with a full human range of practical and theoretical intelligence, with expectations of a future life, if we do that, we make a moral decision approximately as significant and irrevocable as the decision to have a child. In fact, we should turn the argument from existential debt on its head. If we truly create human-grade AI, we would owe it more than we normally owe to human strangers. We would owe it more because we, like parents, would be responsible for its having come into existence, and to a substantial extent, for its happy or miserable state. If we as a society someday create truly human-grade AI with the same range of conscious states and potentialities as human beings have, and if we then enslave and kill it in large numbers, we will, to put it lightly, have been really terrible parents. To put it less lightly, we will have done perhaps the morally worst thing that any society has ever done in the history of all Earth. All right, so here's a slide from the classic science fiction movie Blade Runner, depicting an AI who is not grateful to his creator for having been given 4 years. All right. So let's say that you agree with me about this, and you agree that if we someday create human-grade AI, we should treat it very cautiously, with the same kind of respect and care that we owe human children. If we someday create human-grade AI, but here we face a puzzle. How will we know when we've crossed that line? I'm going to make a simplifying assumption here. I'm going to assume that AI deserves full moral status like humans if and only if it has conscious experiences like ours. This then throws us sharply upon the puzzle of consciousness. As you might know, there's currently immense scientific and philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness. Positions held by prominent researchers run the whole gamut from panpsychism, according to which consciousness is all-pervasive, perhaps even in individual fundamental particles like protons, electrons, to very restrictive views on which only human beings are conscious. Not even dogs and monkeys are conscious. Some theorists think that consciousness requires the specific biology of the vertebrate brain. Others think that consciousness can occur even in programmed classical AI systems. Others think that consciousness requires some sort of naturally evolved, environmentally reactive entity, but doesn't require a brain much like ours. Still others think that the concept of consciousness is so deeply incoherent and so laden with false presuppositions that we should just forget the whole business. I've read widely in this literature. Philosophy of consciousness has been my primary specialization for 22 years. Although researchers build their fame with bold, positive theories which they confidently defend, to me it's clear that the most epistemically responsible position concerning theories of consciousness is one of high uncertainty. Maybe someday we'll figure it out. But as of now, we are quite far from any sort of justifiable scientific consensus, with no realistic near-term or even medium-term hope of resolution. Some theories are very liberal, seeing consciousness everywhere, or at least in very many places. Other theories are very conservative, seeing consciousness as a rare and delicate achievement. So here's what's going to happen. We will create more and more sophisticated AIs. At some point, we'll create AIs that some people think are genuinely conscious and genuinely deserve rights. We're already near that threshold. There's already a robot rights movement. There's already a society modeled after the famous animal rights organization, PETA, P-E-T-A, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, called People for the Ethical Treatment of Reinforcement Learners. These are currently small movements, but as AI gets cuter and more sophisticated, and as chatbots start sounding more and more like normal humans, these movements will gain steam among people with liberal views of consciousness. At some point, people will demand serious rights for some AI systems. The AI systems themselves, if they're capable of speech or speech-like outputs, might also demand or seem to demand rights. Let me be clear, this will happen whether or not these systems really are conscious. Even if you're very conservative in your view about what kinds of systems could be conscious, you should, I think, acknowledge the likelihood that if technological development continues on its current trajectory, there will eventually be groups of people who assert the need to give AI systems human-like moral consideration. And then we'll need a good, scientifically justified consensus theory of consciousness to sort it out. Is this system that says, hey, I'm conscious just like you, really conscious just like you? Or is it just some empty algorithm, no more conscious than a toaster? Here's my conjecture. We will face this social problem before we succeed in developing the good, scientifically justified consensus theory of consciousness that we need to solve the problem. We will then have machines whose moral status is unclear. Maybe they deserve rights. Maybe they're really conscious like us. Maybe they don't. We won't know. And then if we don't know, we'll face really quite a terrible dilemma. If we don't give these machines rights, which seems the likelier option, and if it turns out that the machines really do deserve rights, then we'll be perpetrating slavery and murder every time we assign a task and delete a program. So it might seem safer, if there is reasonable doubt, to assign rights to machines. But on reflection, this isn't so safe. We want to be able to turn off our machines if we need to turn them off. Futurists like Nick Bostrom have emphasized, rightly in my view, the potential risks of letting superintelligent machines loose into the world. These risks are greatly amplified if we too casually decide that such machines deserve rights and that deleting them is murder. Giving an entity rights, well, that sometimes entails sacrificing others' interests for it. Suppose there's a terrible fire. In one room, there are 6 robots who might or might not be conscious. In another room, there are 5 humans who definitely are conscious. You can only save one group. The other group will die. If we give robots who might be conscious equal rights with humans who definitely are conscious, then you ought to go save the 6 robots and let the 5 humans die. If it turns out that the robots underneath really are just toasters, then that's a tragedy. So let's not too casually assign human-like rights to AI systems. Unless there's some astounding saltation in the science of consciousness, or alternatively, unless there's some substantial deceleration in the progress of AI technology, it's likely that we'll face this dilemma. Either deny robots rights and risk perpetrating a holocaust against them, or give robots rights and risk sacrificing real human beings for the benefit of mere empty machines. Now, that might seem bad enough. But the problem is even worse than I and my sunny optimism have so far let on. I've assumed that AI systems are relevant targets of moral concern if they're human grade, that is, if they're like us in their conscious capacities. But the odds of creating only human grade AI are slim. In addition to the kind of AI we currently have, which I assume doesn't deserve any serious rights or moral status, there are, I think, 4 broad moral categories into which future AI might fall. Animal grade, human grade, superhuman, and divergent. So let's think about animal grade AI. Not only human beings deserve moral consideration, so also do dogs, apes, and dolphins. Animal protection regulations apply to all vertebrates. Scientists can't treat even frogs and lizards more roughly than necessary. The philosopher John Basil has argued that AI systems with cognitive capacities similar to vertebrates ought to receive similar protections. Just as we shouldn't torture and sacrifice a mouse without excellent reason, so also, according to Basil, we shouldn't abuse and delete animal-grade AI. Basil has proposed that we form committees modeled on university animal care and use committees to evaluate cutting-edge AI research to monitor when we might be starting to cross this line. Even if you think human-grade AI is decades away, it seems reasonable given the current consciousness, chaos and consciousness studies to wonder whether animal grade consciousness might be around the corner. I myself have no idea if animal grade AI is right around the corner, or if it's far away in the almost impossible future. I think you have no idea either. The superhuman AI, as I'm defining it here, is AI who has all of the features of human beings in virtue of which we deserve moral consideration, but who also has some potentially morally important features far in excess of the human, raising the question of whether such AI might deserve more moral consideration than human beings. Now, there aren't a lot of philosophers who are simple utilitarians, but let me illustrate this using utilitarianism as an example. According to simple utilitarianism, we morally ought to do what maximizes the overall balance of pleasure versus suffering in the world. Now, let's suppose we can create an AI that's genuinely capable of pleasure and suffering. I don't know what it will take to do that, but not knowing is part of my point here, right? Let's just suppose. Now, if we can create such an AI capable of genuine pleasure, then it might also be possible to create an AI capable of much, much more pleasure than a human being is capable of. Consider the maximum amount of pleasure that you've ever felt in your whole life over the course of 1 minute. Call that amount of pleasure X. This AI, maybe, is capable of feeling 1 billion times more pleasure than X in that same 1 minute. It's a super pleasure machine. Now, if morality demands that we should maximize the amount of pleasure in the world, it would thereby demand, or seem to demand, that we ought to create as many of these super pleasure machines as we possibly can. We ought maybe even immiserate and destroy ourselves to do so if enough AI pleasure is created as a result. Even if you think pleasure isn't everything, surely it's something. If someday we could create a super pleasure machines, maybe we ought morally to make as many as we can, or as many as we can reasonably manage. Think of all the joy that we'd be bringing into the world. Or is there something too weird about that? Now, I put the point in terms of pleasure, but whatever the source of human value is, whatever it is that makes us so awesomely special that we deserve the highest level of moral consideration, whatever it is, unless we go maybe theological and appeal to our status as God's creations, right? Whatever it is, it seems possible in principle that we could create that same thing in machines in larger quantities. We love our rationality, our freedom, our individuality, our independence, our ability to value things, our ability to participate in moral communities, our capacity for love and respect. There are lots of wonderful things about us. What if we were to design machines that somehow had a lot more of those things than we ourselves do? We humans might not be the pinnacle. And if not, well, should we bow out, allowing our interests and maybe the whole species to be sacrificed for something greater? As much as I love humanity, under certain conditions, I'm inclined to think the answer should probably be yes. I'm not sure what those conditions would be. Now, the most puzzling case I think, as well as the most likely, is divergent AI. Divergent AI would have human or superhuman levels of some features that we tend to regard as important to moral status, but subhuman levels of other features. For example, it might be possible to design AI with immense theoretical and practical intelligence, but with no capacity for genuine joy and suffering. Such AI might have conscious experiences with little or no emotional valence. It would never feel, wow, yippee, and it would never be crushingly disappointed or bored or depressed. It can still think things like there's a mountain over there and a river over there, and here's the best way to grandma's house. Now, it isn't clear what the moral status of such an entity would be. On some moral theories, it would deserve human grade rights. On other moral theories, it might not matter how we treat it. Or consider the converse, right? A super pleasure machine, but one with little or no capacity for rational thought. It's like one giant irrational orgasm all day long. Would it be great to make such things and terrible to destroy them? Or is such irrational pleasure not really worth much in the moral calculus? Philosophers argue about this stuff, but AI possibilities might really make those arguments practical. Or consider a third type of divergence, which I've elsewhere called fission-fusion monsters, right? A fission-fusion monster is an entity that can divide or merge at will. It starts perhaps basically as a human-grade AI, but when it wants, it can split into 6 or 100 or 1,000,000 descendants, each of whom inherits the capacities, memories, plans, and preferences of the original AI. These descendants can then go about their business, doing their independent things for a while, and then if they want, merge back together into a unified whole, remembering what each individual did during the period of individuality. Other parts might not merge back and choose instead to remain as individual, independent existences, perhaps eventually coming to feel independent enough from the original to see the prospect of merging as something akin to death. Without getting into the details here, a fission-fusion monster like that would risk breaking our concepts of individual rights, such as one person, one vote. The idea of individual rights rests fundamentally on the idea of people as individuals who live in a single body for a while and then die, with no prospect of splitting and merging. What would happen to our concept of individual rights if we were to share the planet with entities for which our accustomed model of individuality was radically false? All right, so let me summarize and then offer some policy suggestions. So first, human-grade AI might come soon, or it might not come for a long time in the future, or it might never come. We currently don't know enough about AI and the science of consciousness to justifiably defend a consensus guess. Second, if fully conscious human-grade AI does come, it will deserve human-like rights. Arguments against giving it rights all fail. In fact, we will owe it a duty of special parent-like care because we will have been its creators. Third, it's likely that we will create AI that some people think deserve human-like rights before we can really assess whether it does in fact deserve human-like rights. We'll then face a choice between possibly giving it too little moral status or too much moral status, and either of those possibilities is a moral disaster. And fourth, the situation is further complicated by the possibility of animal-grade AI that deserves animal-grade rights, superhuman AI that might deserve superhuman rights, and divergent AI that doesn't fit into our usual frameworks for rights and moral status. The animal grades issue in particular might be in the near future, adding some urgency to figuring these things out. All right, so I have 4 policy suggestions to conclude. Right. First, prioritize consciousness research. Although I don't hope for a definitive resolution to debates about consciousness anytime in the near to medium term future, The more progress we can make in consciousness science, the better we can understand at least the structure of the possibility space. In other work, Mara Garza and I have defended what we call the design policy of the excluded middle, expanding on a suggestion by computer scientist Joanna Bryson. The idea is to avoid creating entities whose moral status is ambiguous. If we create entities whose moral status is ambiguous, we create the dilemma I discussed earlier about possibly over-attributing or under-attributing rights. We should either, as Bryson suggests, only create AI systems simple enough that we know they don't deserve rights, or we should go all the way and create AI systems that clearly are fully equal with us and which we then treat accordingly. It's the unclear cases in the middle that create the worst ethical problems. Third, create a framework for evaluating the potential moral status of future AI systems. This is the suggestion of philosopher John Basil. Now, I'm reluctant to create extra layers of bureaucracy modeled on institutional review boards and animal care and use committees, but I do think at some point, panels need to be formed to attempt to assess when and whether AI systems start to enter the gray zone for having moral status based on our best understanding of the science. There are engineers who would love to, and who think that they soon will be able to, create genuinely conscious machines. Now, if they succeed or even credibly claim to succeed, well, there should be some framework already in place to evaluate their results and make some ethical determination about the appropriate societal response and regulations. And finally, I think we should creatively imagine the future, right? Artists have a role here. Robots were imagined in fiction long before they became a reality. Much of the best and most interesting thoughts on the ethics of artificial intelligence has come not from academic research scholars, but rather from creative artists who can think past the current moment into possible futures, imagining ways in which those futures might go well or badly. I hope the art generation of the future is not only a generation of artists who live in what we in 2021 think of as the future, but also that many of them can use their skills to help humanity better imagine and understand the technological possibilities that we're hurtling toward.